Thank you. I have one of the best jobs in the world, and I've been doing it for 30 years. People send us, and there's 450 of us at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, people send us their cars and let us test them and try to figure out how they work and when they won't work, what the unintended consequences are. We've been doing this for 30 years. We work with 100 sponsors, 14 of the car manufacturers, many suppliers to do this. It's a fantastic job. The other reason I have a really great job is I'm getting older. As you can tell by my beard, I'm almost 60. That means I can say pretty much whatever I want. And in addition to that, I have a great job because I have tenure, which means I can absolutely say whatever I want. So what I'm going to tell you today is what we all believe is a revolution, from media, from partnerships created every day, and amazing things happening. But I would, from my humble point of view, it's really more of an evolution because we've been doing this for so long. So what we really need to ask ourselves is when autonomous vehicle technology will be nearly perfect. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, it needs to be nearly perfect. And there's a lot of advocates that say it's already there. We're killing 37,000 plus people a year on our roadways. We really need to get this out as soon as possible. Those are all good points that need to be considered. But it really needs to be nearly perfect because you're not going to get in a robotic taxi if 15,000 fatalities are occurring with robotic taxis. You're just not going to accept that. So when will it be nearly perfect? Technology experts say between 3 and 10 years. At VTTI, we think probably 5 years from now it'll be nearly perfect. Now that doesn't mean you're not going to see it. You're going to see it in really kind of limited operations, and I'll talk about that also in a few minutes. So it's really going to take 5 years before it gets there. Now, you also have to keep in mind that we've been testing automated technology for 20 years. You heard about automatic electronic braking. We started testing that 20 years ago. And so what that means is it takes a great deal of time for things to get deployed. And so we started testing automated braking over 20 years ago. It became available for the first time in the U.S. in 2013. And as you see, our friends from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they predict that there will be 50% deployment of this system by 2026, and if you follow the chart up, 90% deployment by 2040. That's a ways away. And you've got to understand that this technology is accepted by everybody. The car manufacturers made a voluntary standard to get this on all cars within 5 years. So this is about the fastest that you can deploy something and get it through the fleet. So that's something to consider. So what is the shortest time to deploy technology? Well, about 50% of vehicles you'll see with substantial automation in about 13 years after it's perfect, assume nothing else bad goes wrong, and about 90% in 27 years. So it's a little ways away. One of the things you have to consider that these systems might not be deployed even that fast because there's a number of factors that are involved. Trust in automation and the desire to own an automated vehicle is relatively flat over the last few years. People talk about millennials don't want to even own cars anymore. They just want to do rideshare and things like that. But millennials and everybody else have been buying cars at a very brisk pace, manually driven cars the last few years as the economy's gotten better. And, in addition to that, we hear about Uber and Lyft and things like that. So maybe we don't need cars. You can use car share, ride share, all of those things, and they're tremendous services. But you have to keep in mind that they are less than 0.2% of all the trips in the U.S., even despite their tremendous success. So it's going to be a while. But the biggest factor is risk perception. And risk perception is how risky you think something is. And so what that means to you is there is an actual risk associated with doing something and then your perception thereof. And people are sometimes really terrible about judging actual risks. Examples include commercial airline safety, where there's a real fear of ceding control over a situation. Most people realize that flying commercially is safer than driving a car. If you did a survey of the U.S. today, they would say it's twice as safe. But in reality, if you look at fatalities over a number of years, it's really 2,000 times as safe. And so that's an example where the perception of risk is drastically different than the actual risk. For whatever reason, manual driving gets a bye when it comes to risk. We literally kill 100 people every day on our roadways, but people really don't view it as that risky. And if you compare that to shark attacks, if somebody gets attacked by a shark off the coast of North Carolina or someplace, it's a tragic event. It's in the mainstream media for days. People get off the beaches. We kill more people in cars every day than sharks have killed people in the U.S. in the last 200 years. That's the difference in risk perception. So, what's going to be the difference between perceived and actual risk for manual driving? There's lots of studies over a number of years that show that it's going to be 1,000 to 1. And so what does that mean to you? Well, what that means to you is AVs cannot crash very often. In fact, they have to be really nearly perfect. And if you do the numbers, we kill 37,000 people each year manually. The risk perception for autonomous vehicles is going to be 1,000 times greater. So that means to be perceived as equally dangerous, we can only kill 37 people a year. That's a really tough problem. So another factor to consider is, are drivers terrible? I just told you, 30 other people have told you, 37,000 people die on our roadways, 94% due to human error. Are drivers terrible? I'd say yes and no. One thing to consider is the average driver in the United States has a serious crash every 17.9 years, serious being police reported. A good driver that chooses to drive alert, attentive, and sober on every time they drive reduces that risk by a factor of 3. So that what that means to you is there's a substantial portion of the population that will go through an entire lifetime of driving and never crash, never have a serious crash. So for moral or ethical reasons or whatever reasons, how many times can AVs crash to make those people equally as safe in an autonomous car as they are in a manual car? Zero, right? If you go through an entire lifetime of driving and you never crash because you're a really good driver, you don't want to get in a robotic taxi that kills 15,000 people a year. So that's a big issue. There are other factors to consider, when you talk about AVs and when they'll be deployed. For example, the presence of manual driving, right? So I told you, the reason I didn't take the other chart and go out to 100% is there's very few things in the transportation world that are 100%. Seatbelts have been around for decades. If you survey people, they know they save lives. We've had laws passed, we've had public awareness campaigns, we've had all kinds of things, yet between 10 and 20% of people still don't wear seatbelts. Automation. The automatic transmission was really invented over 70 years ago. And it's been extremely popular. A lot of cars have automatic transmission, but even today, 5% of the vehicles on the road still have manual transmissions. And you can still go to a dealership and buy one. In many dealerships, a manual transmission is now more expensive than an automated transmission, yet people still buy them. That's because people drive for fun. They just like to drive. But how does that affect the system? Okay, if you have manual drivers on the road, it greatly increases the variability of what you have to deal with. If every vehicle on the road were autonomous and all followed the same rules, the AA problem is a much simpler problem than with drivers. Drivers do not follow rules. The average speed on our interstates is greater than the speed limit. You see people doing illegal turns, illegal maneuvers all the time. We did a study at Virginia Tech a few years ago, which was essentially how many people stop for a right on red after stop, which is the law. Well, the answer is less than 50%. That doesn't surprise you too much, but probably what does surprise you is the average speed for the people that don't stop is 11 miles an hour. And there's huge variability. Some people are up to close to 20 miles an hour, and that's very hard for autonomous vehicles to really develop the intelligence to be able to predict all this human behavior. But there will always be manual driving. So when will autonomous vehicles be deployed? Well, you're seeing them now, really. And it's just perhaps not when as much as where. You can drive hands off, feet off, or at least get both lateral and longitudinal control at this point in 5 production vehicles. And so it's already happening. But when is it really going to be perfect enough where you can watch the movie or take your eyes off the road? Not sooner than 5 years for nearly perfect technology. If you add to that 13 years for the 50% point in market penetration of autonomous vehicles, that gets us out to 2035. So by 2035, even though you will have experienced a lot of technology, whether it's a robotic taxi in a city or highway driving, or coming later would be bad weather and rural driving, 2035, half the cars on the road will be substantially automated. To get to the 90% point, you got to go out to 2049. And so that's really a long time from now. And I can't emphasize this enough. If we don't do it right, you can add 5 to 10 years to those numbers, because if they crash more than is acceptable, governments, individuals, they're not going to accept the technology, and they're going to slow it down because they're either not going to buy it or they're going to have to legislate to protect the public. And so that could get you out to 2054 or 2059. And so I'm not here to try to say that this isn't a great thing. It is a tremendous thing. And I'm not here to say that we don't see the benefits. There are tremendous safety, mobility benefits for disabled populations and underserved populations. It's going to be great. We just have to do it right, and it's going to take a while. That's what we do at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. Thank you.